Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Schwak. I'm co-founder and CTO of Made of Air. Today we're trying something new. It's a new series called Climate Crash Course, where we like to introduce you to topics around climate change that are on our minds and how we think about them. Why haven't we solved climate change yet? I would say that has to do with how developed our societies are. So I think before we act, we like to quantify. We essentially have two things in my mind that establish consensus around the world. One is numbers and money, essentially the same thing. And before we can act, we tend, as very developed societies, to first have to quantify, de-risk, etc. So it's very hard to develop consensus to go forward. We have a problem both in the analysis, so it took us a long time to quantify the effect of climate change. And even there's still a lot of difficulties with the numbers. So if the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, releases a number saying that climate will change by 1.5 degrees, if you read a little deeper, it always comes with a probability, and that's a hefty probability. Now we're facing another problem, now that we've established that climate change is happening, even if the numbers are maybe not completely accurate or binary. But what we have now is a problem of quantifying the effects of our solutions. And that's slowing things down. So this is kind of where you can see maybe a drawback in this very critical situation of having highly developed societies, highly developed industrial processes that are super efficient, just in time. We can't stop these things. They operate in very fine margins, and jobs depend on them. Money depends on them. So it's very, very difficult to agree on how to move forward. What is carbon neutral? What is net zero? This is very confusing, and I think the confusion works in many cases for the people that have created such terms as carbon neutral. Carbon neutral is by far the most vague term in this sort of set of terms. It essentially means that anyone can continue business as usual, purchase offsets, and I would say in many cases questionable offsets, and claim that they have compensated for their emissions. Net zero is a much more scientifically or numbers-based term, and it places an onus on people that make this claim to first put all their efforts into reducing their emissions and only to deploy carbon removal once they have identified the emissions that they cannot reduce through other means. Is carbon capture enough to stop climate change? Well, I think I started to answer that in the last question. It is definitely not enough. Of course, the biggest effort we have is to reduce emissions, but it is also a scientific fact that once we have done all our efforts to reduce everything that we emit, improve our energy as much as we can, there will still be too much CO2 in the air, and that has to do with the time lag of CO2 in the atmosphere. So even if we stop all activities now, that CO2 will be up there for decades, centuries, and so there's this time lag that means that even if we transition now, we will have to correct for the historical emissions. There is a finite amount of carbon historically that we can emit in order to achieve our climate targets, and we will overshoot. That is the scientific consensus. Can I really offset my carbon footprint? I would say potentially, but to do it well requires a lot of scrutiny of the actual offset measure that you're investing in. I would be very skeptical of purchasing offsets on the plane without knowing where exactly that money is going. Is it going to a afforestation project in Eastern Africa that ceases to be monitored after 5 years? There's a lot of these questions around, especially the nature-based solutions, that are very problematic. So I do think it's possible, but it just requires a lot of work individually, or it requires intermediaries that are responsible. And I think they're coming online, that you can trust that they will do the vetting for you. And the final question today is, can't we plant more trees to counter CO2 emissions? The biggest problem I see with the tree approach is that, of course, let's think about how the CO2 ended up in the atmosphere. Most of the CO2 was initially drawn down in a period called the Carbonium in English, where there were elevated levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, maybe 1,000 ppm, so about 2.5 times as much as we had experienced now, and that allowed for a huge growth spurt of biomass. At the same time, there was a lack of microbes that were able to actually gobble up the trees. So the trees could grow unperturbed, fall over, fall into the ocean, get covered geologically, and go underground. And that happened for probably 100 million years. So we have millions of generations of trees and biomass that formed the fossil reservoirs of carbon in which we were now tapping to fire our industrial revolution and our societal progress. So at no given time do we have enough land mass to grow the trees that were grown in repeated generations during those 100 million years of the Carbonium. So while tree planting, afforestation, reforestation in particular play an important role in terms of quantities, there's a severe limitation to how much historical carbon they can mop up. To wrap it up, I just want to say thanks for joining us today for our first episode of Climate Crash Course. For me, it's really been fun. I'm looking forward to seeing you again next time. And of course, feel free to share it if you found anything interesting that I said. We'd love to see those likes and shares. Thanks a lot.